Server 1. Greenie screamed, her breath fogging with the cool forest air. She watched from her chains as the last member of her squad, Warden Smith, was skewered by the dead king's sword. Ghostly mist poured off of the transparent iridescent blade, slowly eating away at the warden's black armor. She wanted to look away, knowing what was coming next, but she couldn't. Warden Smith, like the dozen or so squad mates before him, looked at the dead king wide-eyed as his life force was siphoned out of him. His health bar drained, changing from green to yellow and finally red. His bearded face, a face that she had secretly come to love during her time with the Black Knights, was reduced to a wrinkled, lifeless husk. The dead king withdrew his sword, and Warden Smith dropped unceremoniously to the forest floor, his armored body hitting the dead leaves with a metallic thump. Greenie dropped to her knees, her chains jangling. Looking up, the king began walking towards her, stepping over the warden's body, twigs and foliage crunching beneath his worn boots. The moon was rising above him, illuminating his rusty crown and armor, rotten skin, and snow-white hair that fell to his shoulders. His tattered red cape fluttered with the forest breeze. He stopped halfway. He stared, as if he was looking straight through her black armor and into her soul, like he could see her grief and pain. She scrambled to her feet and returned his gaze with a scowl, desperately trying to control her shaking, something the warden had reprimanded her for during her training. The dead king lifted his sword in the air. The mist coming from the blade grew and fell to the ground, creating a layer of fog that went up to their knees. Then, one by one, her fallen comrades reanimated around her, with Warden Smith being the last one to stand. She looked at her dead friends, and they returned her gaze with empty black eye sockets. Her chains disintegrated, and the dead king pointed his sword directly at her. Her squad mates charged. The world slowed down, and muscle memory took control. She held out her right hand. Her sword materialized in her palm, something she'd done thousands of times before. The familiar feel of the blade gave her hope, even though, deep down, she knew it was naive, knowing what she was up against. She prayed to the admin, activating her 24-hour ability. If her squad mates were anything like they were during life, she knew this would give her the best chance of survival. Her health bar grew to 3 times its initial size. They clashed for what seemed like hours, the dead king watching the entire time. Greenie dodged their strikes and abilities only to be met with their true attacks, but she'd been ready for some of them, recognizing many of the maneuvers they had practiced together. Her friends weren't as coordinated as they had been when they were alive. That was the only reason she was still breathing. Greenie had been picked out of hundreds of guild members to join the warden's squad, yet she always felt like she was the weakest of the group, like she was an imposter. Warden Smith would often need to remind her that she was chosen for good reason, though she never knew what that reason was. Her blade was a blur as she tore through the last members of her former squad, leaving one last challenger. Warden Smith, or what was left of him, circled around her like a vulture, waiting for his chance to dig into his next meal. She knew that even in his weakened state, this fight would not be easy. He lunged with unbelievable speed, expertly parrying her attack and striking her hard enough to crack her ribs. Her health bar dipped from yellow to red. She was more agile than the warden. She always had been. But Warden Smith had always been built like a tank. His strikes were always twice as hard as hers. She'd always hated sparring with him. She swung her sword at his neck, but he avoided the strike effortlessly, like he was expecting the attack months in advance. He struck her again in the face. When she dropped to her knees, he grabbed her skull and drove his armored kneecap into her jaw. He hoisted his blade into the air, ready to deliver the killing blow. He brought the blade down hard, crashing it into her own. Her world was spinning, and it took everything she had to hold up her sword. There was no way she could survive this, she thought. If it was truly her time, she wouldn't leave the warden in the hands of the dead king. They'd go together. The warden lifted his sword once again, and Greenie harnessed every drop of strength she had left. This time the warden thrusted his sword forward. She did the same. They impaled each other. He let go of his sword and fell backward. He stumbled, trying to regain his footing, and he did momentarily. Trembling, he reached out for her, then went limp. He fell to the ground with a final slam. Greenie had fallen on her side. Her health bar had been reduced to less than 1%, and with the sword inside of her, she was bleeding out. The forest was eerily quiet. Then she heard footsteps coming towards her. Her vision was beginning to blur, but she could just make out the silhouette of the approaching dead king. A UI window appeared in front of her. The dead king Zukuda, leader of the Dark Disciples, has invited you to become his familiar. Her eyes grew wide. She looked up at the dead king, then back at the UI window. She had heard of familiars before. If she accepted, her life would be saved, but in return, it would be bound to the dead king's, and she would have to serve him. Her health bar continued to drop. She looked to the window again. Do you accept? Yes or no? She made her choice. Check the pinned comment for a special message. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for more.